Everybody likes marching songs. I mean, what better way to keep your spirits up when holding all of your arms and armour across the land towards the immortal glory of the next decisive battle and the great plunder that awaits you after, right? Hello everyone, it's Oscar at the Virtual Victualler here, and today I will be doing another bit of Landsknecht myth busting, and boy is this necessary. Unlike some other famous military units of history, looking at you there Romans, for the 16th century German mercenaries known as Landsknechte, quite a few marching songs have been preserved, at least at first glance. But here's the problem. Songs often get reused throughout history, and sometimes also by people with less than savoury motives. And as you might very well be aware, 19th and 20th century German history is complicated. So you might find yourself humming along to a very catchy Landsknecht song, only to realise that your latest earworm has actually been used by the Nazi party at some point. Awkward. Added to this problem, most Landsknecht songs that we are aware of aren't even from the 16th century. When the Botha Lucas Choir was recording their Landsknecht Trommel collection in the 1960s, they weren't necessarily recording original Landsknecht songs, but rather songs that the choir members and their audience may have remembered from their youth. So rather than this being a list of songs that you can actually sing while marching towards Pavia, because that would be a really short list, I'd like this to rather be a bit of a cultural history endeavour, to look at how Landsknechte were perceived in different historical periods, at least through the lens of songs. Interest in Landsknechte surged from the 1840s onward with the rise of German nationalism, and after very briefly talking about the original 16th century Landsknecht songs that we know, that will be a starting point for today. And we'll follow that through all the way through the German Empire, the World War, the Weimar Republic, and of course finally also Nazi Germany and the Second World War. For each of these periods I've picked one song that is either about Landsknechte or very strongly inspired by them, and that gives me the opportunity to talk about those periods of German history for a little bit. However, it is important to keep in mind that these songs get reused later, sometimes even by groups on opposite sides of the political spectrum, and that even nowadays some people and groups are using them to politicize perceptions of who and what Landsknechte were. So check out my Patreon, just in case YouTube considers this topic a little bit too spicy. Anyway, let's start all the way back in the 16th century, at the time that Landsknechte themselves were marching to great battles and sieges during the Italian wars. La 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 la. Wir zogen in das Feld, wir zogen in das Feld, da hätten wir weder Säckel noch Geld, strammele mi, alla mi presente, al vostra signori, alla mi presente, al vostra signori. The only truly unequivocally 16th century Landsknecht song that we have is the anonymous Wir zogen in das Feld, which was preserved for posterity in Georg Forster's second volume of the Frische Deutsche Liedlein book in 1540. Apart from the very early date, another reason why this is perhaps the most Landsknecht song of all is that it so accurately reflects the experience of Knechte in the field that we see in other primary sources. The Landsknechte start out their campaign with neither money nor even purses, but with every Italian city they reach, they improve their situation somewhat. When we look at literature and more reliable sources, such as letters written by officers, Landsknechte facing poor conditions on campaigns and looting everything that was not bolted down were very common themes in how Landsknechte were perceived and how they perceived themselves. And Wir zogen in das Feld really reflects these themes rather well, I think.
Landsknecht bin ich von Natur und echt an Krieg und wander nur, füg selbst mein Glück in Scherben. Hätt keinen Sinn fürs Elternhaus, drum muss ich auch, man sieht's voraus. Verderben, verderben.
We move on to the 19th century with Ein Landsknecht bin ich von Natur. This song about the Landsknecht urge to wander and get yourself killed in battle is already a bit confusing to me, because I can't quite seem to pinpoint at what time the lyrics were added to the melody. But it would generally fit with themes of German Romanticism, with its focus on emotion and its heroic themes, often inspired by medieval history. Here's what I managed to find out. The text is highly likely 19th century, and the melody was composed in 1842 by Justus Wilhelm Lyra. What we do know for sure is that this song was also sung with the lyrics of Die Bange Nacht, which is a poem about all the emotions one would experience on the eve of fighting a great battle for freedom. And it's really no surprise that this particular version became rather popular during the 1848 nationalist revolt in German lands. The melody and both associated texts would continue to be adapted in later eras, but let's get back to that down the line.
Und biegt im Winde sich. Unser Wams von Büffelleder ist zerfetzt von Hieb und Stich, Stich und Hieb. Und ein Lieb muss ein Landsknecht haben.
The year is 1871. German lands have just united into a full-fledged nation-state, not as a people's movement as the 1848 revolution envisioned, but rather under the top-down guidance of the Iron Chancellor and the Hohenzollern monarchs. This new German Empire was a world power in the midst of the Industrial Revolution. It is in this context that the first youth movements appear. The Wandervögel, or wandering birds, were the first of these, and especially in these early days, their focus lay very strongly on offering middle-class adolescents a way of escaping the polluted cities by organizing hikes in nature. Both the wandering and the singing were still heavily inspired by German Romanticism, which would go a long way to explain the popularity of Landsknechte and Landsknecht-inspired songs like Vom Ballette schwankt die Feder. As a side note, the level of Landsknecht reenactment before the First World War was exceptionally high. I mean, look at that mad drip.
Der Tod reitet auf einem kohlschwarzen Rappen, trägt ein undurchsichtig Kappen. Wenn Landsknecht in das Feld marschieren, lässt sein Ross daneben galoppieren. Flandern in Not, in Flandern reitet der Tod. In Flandern reitet der Tod.
Every Belle Époque must end, though. In the summer of 1914, Europe sleepwalked into one of the most deadly conflicts in history. A war that would keep swallowing men and materiel until the guns would finally fall silent 4 years later. In the trenches of the Western Front, one could not help but associate every sound of flying steel with the idea of death, as Lieutenant Ernst Junge would later write. Members of the German youth movements, associating themselves with the very Knechte they had been singing about previously, were thrust into a combat where death could come from literally anywhere. It's no surprise, therefore, that Landsknecht-inspired songs quickly came rather more macabre, as illustrated by Der Tod in Vlaanderen. Originally, this song started out in the opposing trench, as the Flemish song called De Vlaamse Dodendans, but it was quickly picked up by German soldiers on the other side as well. Apart from referencing Landsknechte, the song also harks back to another very well-known 16th century theme, that of the Todendans, or Dance of Death, where death, personified by a skeleton or a grim hooded figure, would take everyone for a final dance, regardless of class position or wealth. With the near-constant artillery shelling at Verdun, the Somme and Ypres, the theme of death beating his drum to take the soldiers' lives one by one was very clearly understood on both sides of no man's land.
Görg von Frunsberg führt uns an. Tralalalala. Der die Schlacht gewann, Lehrmann von Pavia. Der die
Few things are like watching a car crash unfold in slow motion than learning about the Weimar Republic. Recently, historians have started to challenge views that exclusively focus on the German interwar republic as a failed state that ultimately paved the way for the rise of Nazi Germany. But it cannot be denied that if the interbellum were a real-time strategy game, then picking the Weimar Republic would be putting the game at extreme difficulty settings. World War I was a war of national attrition, unlike anything seen before. And when the German Empire eventually buckled, it had nothing left to give. Despite that, many veterans felt betrayed by their now democratically elected government and decided to join so-called Freikorpse, or free companies. Some of these Freikorpse would be ultimately used by that same government to brutally strike down the communist and anarchist Spartacus revolt. What is left after World War I is a country with a weak government, a large part of the population that does not recognize that government as legitimate, and a broken sense of national pride. So what does that do to the music culture? Some creators here on YouTube suggest that the song Ein Landsknecht bin ich von Natur was a very popular Freikorps song, but all I managed to find out about it is that it was reprinted and repopularized in a songbook that was released in the year 1934. Make of that what you will. The Bundesjugend also made a comeback, although this time around with a far stronger emphasis on uniforms, marching and discipline. And among these youth groups, songs like Georg von Frundsberg about the great German victory at Pavia became very, very popular.
Schwarzer Haufen, heia, oh, und wollen mit Tyrannen raufen, heia, oh, Spieß voran, drauf und dran, setzt aufs Klosterdach den roten an, Spieß voran, drauf und dran, setzt aufs Klosterdach den roten an.
Of course, the National Socialist Party could not remain behind and formed its own youth movement. And it is at this time that Das Schwarzenhaufen, inspired by the 1525 peasant revolt, was written and popularized in Nazi circles. Its violent anti-clerical and anti-nobility themes fit the Nazi worldview that the German people should form something of a Volksgemeinschaft, a community of pure-blooded Germans and without unwanted elements such as Jews, communists and of course members of the LGBTQ community. Ironically, this song has recently been covered by both National Socialist and Communist black metal bands. After 1933, all of German history would be press-ganged into legitimizing the Third Reich, and Landsknechte fared no better. It is therefore all the more remarkable that when Ein Landsknecht bin ich von Natur pops up for a final time in 1942, it is turned into a resistance song that ends with the line, "Turn around your cannons and break the Third Reich into shards."
Unsere liebe Frau vom kalten Ronnen, bescher uns armen Landsknecht eine warme Sonne. Lass uns nicht erfrieren, wohl in des Wirtes Haus, ziehen wir mit vollem Säckel und leeren wieder aus.
Now, time for some final remarks. What does this all mean and what can we learn from this? I personally think that it is fascinating that these Landsknecht songs give us such a clear perspective on how history gets reused and politicized for a variety of different ends. Few Landsknecht songs are as good an example of this as Unsere liebe Frau vom kalten Brunnen. Its first verse comes from Georg Forster's 16th century songbook, and it is very much in character a complaint about a lack of money. A later 16th century variation laments the way that Landsknechte would rob peasants in the countryside, The German youth movements added a couple of verses, and then finally an anti-World War I verse was added as well. In it, the soldiers complain that they have to eat dust while marching, while the emperor is eating up all of Flanders, thinking about conquering the entire world, while the soldiers' wives are at home in anguish. It may be a bit of a contentious point, but here it goes anyway. If you, like me, have a fascination for Landsknechte or any other part of German history, it may very well be that your special interest has already been co-opted in the past by an unsavory political movement, and that someone somewhere is doing the exact same thing right now even. If you're a reenactor or historical fencer, then what you do does not exist in a political vacuum, unfortunately. And how you position yourself in these things really matters in making sure that the wrong people cannot abuse history for their own ends. That's of course how I think about these things, but I'd love to hear what you think in the comments down below. Right now, I'm just going to leave you with one final Landsknecht song, and I wish you all well until the next time. Cheers.
Wir zogen in das Feld, wir zogen in das Feld, da hätten wir weder Säckel noch